In this paper, I will discuss Sarah Bernhardt's usage of the Madonna motif in her autobiography as a jumping-off point for a deeper investigation of her public image. In her memoirs and certain stage performances, Bernhardt carefully reshaped her societal otherness as a Jewish convert to Catholicism, an unwed mother, and a courtesan into a clear message of cultural in-group belonging. In this paper, I analyze that textual negotiation to unpack the logistics of Bernhardt's unlikely success story. She was the daughter of a Jewish Dutch prostitute, but she eventually became France's most globally recognized celebrity, indeed almost a physical embodiment of the French nation in the years surrounding the Dreyfus affair. This is especially impressive when we consider how much of her reputation in popular culture was based, at least initially, on pure shock value. Bernhardt was known for singular things like sleeping in a coffin, wearing a taxidermied bat on her head, and painting and sculpting in her custom-made trouser suit. Rumors flew that she was a habitual cross-dresser, that she owned human skulls, displayed satanic tendencies, moonlighted as a prostitute, and reports from the Parisian vice police who tracked Bernhardt show that some of these rumors, although perhaps exaggerated, did have a basis in truth. One police report from 1874 lists several important men that Sarah has taken as lovers, notes that she has a skull on a silver platter in her living room, habitually wears a skull brooch named Sophie, and is too thin. All of these were viewed as problematic traits. Yet Bernhardt does not choose publicity-driven scandal to cement her legacy for future generations. Instead, her 1907 memoir, Ma Double Vie, or My Double Life, often presents Bernhardt and those closest to her as the intimate protégés, sometimes almost the body doubles, of the Virgin Mary. I argue that this is a metaphorical version of what I call sartorial code switching, or using visual cues related to the body to modify one's public image. As I will show, Bernhardt does this repeatedly and strategically uses it to build an image of herself in her reader's head throughout Ma Double Vie. Bernhardt had to do this because her multifaceted identity did not fit neatly into 19th century bourgeois social norms, and Ma Double Vie often attempts to bridge this gap. So, looking back at how her public image evolved, Aristide Quiet is aware of this. He says, "Malgré ses excentricités aussi également connues du public, les traits de sa physionomie." So despite her eccentricities, which were as well known to the public as the traits of her physical body, in her autobiography Ma Double Vie, elle a tout bien imaginé pour se présenter en bonne posture devant la postérité. So she imagined everything very well to present herself in a good posture for posterity. So he's identifying Bernhardt's eccentricities explicitly here with her physicality, which is something we'll come back to later. But he's also, in discussing her autobiography, complimenting Bernhardt's imaginative ability to present herself well for posterity. And by using terms like elle a tout bien imaginé pour se présenter en bonne posture, he's essentially saying this is a creative act of self-presentation, and bonne posture, or good posture, has that double reading of posing oneself intentionally and perhaps artificially. This is especially interesting when we consider the long tradition of self-discovery and doubleness in classical French autobiography. Notice, for example, how Rousseau introduces his Confession by saying that he will depict doubly, je peindrai doublement, both what happened to him and also how he felt about it while writing it later, that his style will become part of the story. In this description, truth is not just the strict facts of an event, but also the performative truth of memory. So there are layers to the truth that one tells about oneself. I argue that this is the doubleness we should see in the title of Ma Double Vie, and that while there are things in Sarah Bernhardt's autobiography that are not strictly true, we can nevertheless learn a lot of truths about her from how she chooses to present herself in this specific time-honored autobiographical medium that is designed for posterity. And as I had mentioned, so going forward a bit, there are many points in Ma Double Vie where Bernhardt slips in a reference to the Madonna as if to identify herself explicitly with the Virgin Mary, to transfer those protective qualities to herself. We will examine more later, but one of the most obvious is this passage where Bernhardt portrays the legendary Georges Sand as the person giving her the nickname Little Madonna. And she also has Prince Jérôme of the Bonaparte family calling her a little girl. So there are strong themes of innocence and naivete here that could counteract any potential problematic reading, for instance, a lesbian reading of this passage. It's a protective narrative choice. By portraying herself as a little girl and a little Madonna, Bernhardt is also doing something really significant when it comes to the mental image the reader has of her. She is turning her physical slenderness, her littleness, into a marker of sweet innocence. This is important because everyone knew that Bernhardt was considered unattractively skinny, and as I will discuss, there were specific cultural drawbacks to that physique. On the right, we can see Bernhardt's friend and fellow actress Sophie Croisette, Considered to have the perfect body in this time period, she was the pleasingly plump, ideal woman. To a modern viewer, Bernhardt is more ideal, but in her own time, her quote-unquote unnatural thinness caused her a lot of heartache. Bernhardt is wearing one of her signature spiral dresses, which her friend, the composer Reynaldo Hahn, writes was a specific style that she developed in order to disguise her lack of curves. You can see that it has gathered pleats around the torso that swirl down the skirt to draw the eye away from the waist and give an illusion of fullness. She would also wear padding under these dresses, and you can see how careful she is to conceal her thin arms with long sleeves and her neck with a high collar. Bernhardt knew that her thinness could be and was viewed as deviant. And so in the passage we saw earlier, she tries to associate what was a socially problematic body type with the youthful innocence of a little girl, a little Madonna. And then on stage, she tries to modify it like this through the optical illusion of dress. Because she was so naturally slender, Bernhardt did not need to wear a corset, and due to her unique ability to move her body on stage without one, she was known for her sinuous S-curve posturing. Some even credited Bernhardt with inspiring the famously curvaceous Art Nouveau style that would eventually make her a new kind of icon, with the help of artists like Alphonse Mucha, and her popular role as Cleopatra in 1890 featured a live snake. However, Bernhardt's characteristic S-curve was not always viewed in a flattering light. People already believed she was too thin, and some thought her flexible spine could only indicate an equally flexible or non-existent moral center, and that perhaps, to quote one critic, her soul is just as malleable as her body. Biblical associations between women's sin and snakes also fed these beliefs, as we see in this caricature of Bernhardt on the right. In essence, it suggests that Bernhardt's supernatural versatility, both physical and theatrical, can only mean that she is something other than human under the surface, possibly even a monster. One newspaper critic wrote in 1890 that Sarah Bernhardt descends in a curvy line from the serpent who corrupted Eve. But there is an even more problematic interpretation of Bernhardt's slenderness, linking it to anti-Semitic concepts of racial purity. According to John Ephron, anti-Semites in the second half of the 19th century believed that a certain type of, quote, frail, undersized, emaciated body with a long, narrow, flat chest was, quote, characteristic of a large number of Jews, unquote. And this pathological Jewish thinness would often include very specific details, for example, quote, shoulder blades that project in the back like two wings, unquote. We can see this anti-Semitic view of Bernhardt's body in this image entitled Modeste à l'arrivée, arrogante au retour, or modest upon arrival, arrogant upon returning. This is a critique of Bernhardt's behavior during her first tour of America. She was known for her famous voix d'or, or golden voice, which is transformed here into actual gold coins. On the left, as Bernhardt leaves France, she's already quite thin, but has some curves. In the middle, she becomes a towering stick figure spilling gold coins from her mouth in America. And on the right, she is snobby, fashionably dressed because of the money she's made on tour, and even thinner than she was before. The implication is that she has lost the few womanly curves she had, which is somehow linked to her immoral sellout behavior while on tour. But what is even more interesting is that her deviant slenderness is combined with an exaggerated beaked nose, and the gold coins reference stereotypes of Jewish money grubbing. So what we have here is a conglomerate of anti-Semitic stereotypes that target Bernhardt on two fronts: as a person of Jewish ancestry, and also as a woman who dares to be independent, make her own money, and remain unmarried. She is judged exponentially evil by these overlapping gendered and racialized criteria. In this image, such gendered anti-Semitic criticism goes a step further to question whether Bernhardt is even human. Again published during her first American tour, its premise is that Sarah's supposed degeneracy has prematurely aged her until she is little more than a walking corpse. Titled La Vérité sur Sarah, The Truth About Sarah, it purports to show Bernhardt getting assembled backstage by a team of 4 young assistants while intrepid journalists hide on the armoire in the background. One assistant holds a bowl of paint, probably referencing the long-standing negative associations between makeup and prostitution, while another stirs a vat of enamel, suggesting that for this level of physical and moral corruption, simple paint will not be enough. Bernhardt is so far gone she must be shellacked. A third assistant positions a curly wig over her bald head, while a fourth pulls the laces of a corset, which, interestingly enough, is padded out to give the impression of womanly curves. The message is clear. Bernhardt is so thin that she paradoxically requires a corset to fatten her and provide the curves of a womanhood she clearly does not possess. In addition to her, again, exaggerated beaked nose and large Adam's apple, her baldness and thinness here suggest that Bernhardt is simultaneously devoid of femininity and of racial purity. Bernhardt's body here is a clear reference to anti-Semitic notions of deviant Jewish physicality, and one theater critic at this time also described her as a lanky Jewess. But she is also being critiqued as an independent woman and actress, a profession long associated with prostitution and exclusion from the Catholic Church. Bernhardt's negative influence on her assistants is portrayed through their ambiguously tight skirts that echo her trouser-like bloomers. Thus, the image suggests that as they help Bernhardt disguise her horrifyingly desexed, pathologically Semitic body, these young women have begun to stray from proper feminine appearance themselves. In order to mitigate such perceptions of her, Bernhardt appears to have made overt attempts to culturally rehabilitate the person who was the source of her outsider status, her mother Julie, also known as Yule. Notice how in admitting that her mother is a foreigner and describing her as a Dutch Jewess, Bernhardt is careful to add that, on the other hand, she also had a pretty face and beautiful blue eyes. Likewise, in the first pages of her autobiography, we have a careful description of Yule as a Madonna, with golden hair, long eyelashes, slender white fingers, tiny feet, and so on. Bernhardt is careful to emphasize that even if her mother is foreign and Jewish, she's beautiful enough to play the visual part of the Madonna, the ultimate French Catholic female figure. Yule was also a courtesan, and Bernhardt followed in her footsteps as a teenager, supplementing her income with high-class prostitution. So Bernhardt has a vested interest in protecting the socially vulnerable aspects of Yule's identity that reflect on her by associating her mother with the Virgin Mary. We see the same technique recur in several places in Ma Double Vie, where Bernhardt's reputation is potentially threatened by the information that she is sharing with her reader. For instance, when writing about her youthful unchaperoned trip to Spain, she specifies that she first rushed to get her little Virgin Mary statue and make sure her reader knows that she normally takes the statue with her everywhere. Then in Spain, a man enters her room at night to attack her, and she waves the statue and he disappears. The Madonna is thus clearly protecting Bernhardt, and she frames her devotion to the Virgin as part of this divine favor. And we see a really clear example of this in a series of passages from Ma Double Vie that are extremely theatrical. Here, Bernhardt uses metaphorical sartorial code switching to essentially build a stage performance in her audience's head as they read. Sent to a convent school by her French Catholic father and baptized as a teenager, the converted Bernhardt is seized with an intense desire to become a nun. She pictures herself lying on the ground covered in the novitiate cloth, fantasizes about rejecting princes, kings, pearls, palaces, and so on to do this. Notice her usage of the word costume as well. She says no costume could compete in her mind with the black veil and white cambric of the nuns. Even while saying that no costume could compete with a nun's habit, Bernhardt describes it in such theatrical detail that it becomes a metaphorical costume, into which she slips, so that the reader is now picturing her going through the steps of becoming a nun just by reading this. Bernhardt has performed a costume change on the reader's mental image of her, and I argue that because of the strong cultural associations encoded within that nun's costume, this is a sartorial code switch that transfers the visual and thus the moral qualities of a nun partially to Bernhardt herself. But a few chapters later, when Bernhardt decides to become an actress, she again performs a very clever narrative move that allows the Madonna to protect her reputation, as we have previously seen. It is, of course, well known that in this time period, actresses, as I have mentioned, were very much associated with prostitution, routinely disfellowshipped from the Catholic Church, and so on. It was in many ways the exact opposite of becoming a nun. So how does Bernhardt navigate that? She's walking this narrative tightrope between truth and respectability. Well, she brings in the Madonna. She tells her reader how, after deciding to become an actress instead of a nun, she makes a long speech to the Virgin Mary statue at the head of her bed. She says, "I adored the Virgin Mary, and I explained to her my reasons for not being able to take the veil in spite of my vocation. I tried to charm and persuade her, and I kissed her very gently on the foot which was crushing the serpent." So Bernhardt has a specific statue of the Madonna that is stepping on a snake. This is very interesting given how often she was associated with snakes in wider culture. And this passage, as we can see, very neatly works against a lot of the negative assumptions people might have had about her as an actress and as a converted Jew. I argue that by applying certain predetermined sets of social codes to her body in new contexts and combinations, by engaging, in other words, in sartorial code switching, Bernhardt actually ends up often reconfiguring them instead of just replicating them. So sometimes, as in Ma Double Vie, this involves challenging readers' expectations for overt scandal, which they might have been led to expect from her publicity stunts in popular culture. But instead, she enacts a quieter form of subversion by presenting herself in her autobiography and in certain other places as a paradox, a rule-bending, but ultimately a morally unassailable social hybrid. Two publicity posters by her friend Alphonse Mucha show Bernhardt in this mode. On the left, she is portrayed as Marguerite Gautier, a dying courtesan with a heart of gold. Significantly, the stars on the purple background, as we can see here, are tiny stars of David. The sweeping white robe worn by Bernhardt and the white flowers in the foreground communicate a symbolic virtue that works against bourgeois perceptions of prostitution. And the stars of David in the background add another layer of subversion to this presentation of Marguerite as a chaste courtesan, particularly in light of contemporary views about Jewish courtesans like Bernhardt's own mother Yule. So in this image, we see Mucha narrativizing Bernhardt in much the same way that she does for herself in Ma Double Vie. Female sexuality, Bernhardt's Jewish heritage, and her personal reputation are thus simultaneously redeemed in one elegant image. On the right, Mucha's use of this religious iconography goes a step further. His illustration of Bernhardt's role as Fotine in Edmond de Rostand's play La Samaritaine once again features stars of David scattered throughout Bernhardt's hair. Mucha has drawn a stylized halo around her head that marks her as mystical or holy. In the center, there is Hebraic lettering spelling out Jehovah, and along the halo's edge, Bernhardt's name is written in a hybridized Hebrew-Latin script. Rostand created the role of Fotine as a mediating figure between Christianity and Judaism that echoes the Virgin Mary's historical function in Europe. And I argue that hybridity itself is the key factor making Sarah Bernhardt's choice of the Madonna as her mediating figure so clever on multiple levels. After all, as Adrienne Boyerin has shown, historically in Europe, the Virgin Mary was the foundational female model of Christianity and also a Jewess, providing a deep sense of authority for women and providing living Jewesses with a similar kind of authority. Bernhardt thus draws on a powerfully multiple figure of both Christian and Jewish womanhood when she frames herself as a little Madonna. In this sense, the Virgin Mary's appearance throughout Ma Double Vie can be read as a subversive bridge between Judaism and Catholicism that allows Bernhardt to negotiate both categories simultaneously. The cultural specificity of Bernhardt's unusual hybrid position and its potential for subversion is encapsulated in her response to one reporter who asked if she was a Christian. She said, "No, I'm a Roman Catholic and a member of the great Jewish race. I'm waiting until Christians become better." Bernhardt's ability to switch between combined cultural codes is reflected in her choice of stage roles, which, as she gained additional artistic control throughout her life, increasingly fused qualities that contemporaries viewed as incompatible. Bernhardt's ability to combine chastity and sexuality, Judaism and Catholicism in one unifying character is a good example of Judith Butler's subversion from within the terms of the law. As the 19th century drew to a close with the eruption of the Dreyfus affair and the ongoing tensions between France and Germany, Bernhardt continued to claim her multiple identities in the face of rising right-wing nationalism and its attendant anti-Semitism. Despite her foreign roots and Jewish background, she was able to cast herself as so patriotic and quintessentially French that her name became fully identified with France itself in the public mind. By doing so, Bernhardt boldly claimed the right to be both Jewish and French in a time when those notions were increasingly being presented as opposites. For example, Bernhardt's letter that she wrote to a newspaper editor refuting rumors spread by anti-Semites that she was a German Jew working against France is very revealing. She says, "Certainly I am a Jewess, but not a German. All my family come from Holland. If I have a foreign accent, which I much regret, it is cosmopolitan but not Teutonic. I am a daughter of the great Jewish race. I hope your sense of justice will lead you to rectify a mistake, which may not only affect my son's future but is painful to me as a Frenchwoman." Bernhardt's response is very revealing. No, she emphatically declares, she is not German, but she reverses the other half of the accusation, proudly identifying as a daughter of the great Jewish race and seamlessly claiming this heritage alongside that of a patriotic Frenchwoman, which for anti-Semites was a de facto impossibility. Bernhardt performs a similar move in an 1876 sculptural self-portrait that she made titled La Fille de Hollande, a bust of the actress in Gallic costume for her starring role in a play of the same name. By portraying the daughter of a legendary medieval French hero who was also Charlemagne's nephew, Bernhardt ties herself irrevocably to the founding mythologies of France. And all of this was a very conscious choice on her part. La Fille de Hollande was not a very well-written play, Bernhardt admitted, but its main advantage to her was that it had a great patriotic feel. She created similar associations between herself and the nation by chanting the Marseillaise at a Bastille Day celebration and by playing onstage roles like Napoleon's son in L'Aiglon. But the most striking example of her ability to present herself as more French than anyone else is Bernhardt's turn as Saint Joan of Arc. Jeanne d'Arc was perhaps the only female figure who could compare with the Madonna in French society at this time. In some ways, Joan was even more powerfully unifying because she appealed not only to traditional Catholics, but also to secular proponents of the Third Republic. This made her a paradox, a patriotic saint who rose above politics to unify various factions of France, as Vinnie de Dada has remarked. Dada goes on to say that Bernhardt's portrayal of Joan in 1909 was a stunning success that somehow unified all of her spectators except the most recalcitrant among the extreme right. So Bernhardt here again switches cultural codes quite spectacularly, acting in a cross-aged role as the teenage Joan despite being in her 60s at this point, performing gendered cross-dressing in the role of a historical cross-dresser who had nevertheless just been canonized as a saint, portraying a mystical virgin in defiance of her known courtesan past, and perhaps most incredibly, producing herself as a symbolic fusion of national and religious belonging by incarnating one of France's most enduring Catholic icons as a Jewish actress. The mystery behind Joan of Arc's ability to absorb all of these social contradictions is quite clear to Bernhardt. It is nothing less than the power of personal mythology. Speaking of this power in Ma Double Vie, she says, "Legend remains victorious in spite of history. It is impossible now for our brain to picture Jesus and the Virgin Mary accomplishing humiliating human functions. We do not like Joan of Arc to be the rustic, bold peasant girl sitting astride her big purse-drawn horse like a man. We do not care for such useless truths. In the legend, she is a fragile woman guided by a divine soul. It is thus that we wish it to be, and so the legend remains triumphant." Bernhardt's analysis of the mechanisms by which biographical narrative can reframe history is telling when we consider her own usage of such strategies, both in Ma Double Vie and elsewhere. Bernhardt knew how to remain victorious in spite of history and its sometimes useless truths, and I argue that it is precisely because of her multimodal ability to narrativize herself as a seemingly impossible hybridized figure, as an outsider who nevertheless defiantly belongs, that Sarah Bernhardt joins her own list of triumphant legends. Thank you.